we always had this idea of business as usual, right? So the business was in a static state. Somebody came along with a transformation agenda or a big project and said, brilliant, we're going to go from this static state to this other static state, and we need a change plan to be able to help us transition. Part of the challenge that we've got, though, as organizations have an increasing aspiration for agility and for pace and for velocity, is that we've got many, many concurrent projects happening at the same time in the same business, and quite frequently impacting the same parts of the business at the same time. And so what we're finding is that these middle managers are kind of experiencing this sense of compression as they're trying to translate all these different projects into the businesses that they're accountable for supporting and leading. And so the change agenda is now constant. We don't have a static state. There is always the next change which is coming through as organizations respond to kind of the market and the complexity out there. And so as a business, we started out as a bunch of change practitioners who came from the traditional school of change management, right? So we would run portfolios, we would set up change practices, and as a connected network of change professionals, Change as Usual looks after the senior layers of change leadership.
Welcome to episode 43 of the Inner Game of Change podcast, where I focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing and enabling organizational change. My name is Ali Juma, and this is the Inner Game of Change podcast. Today, my guest is Pippa Hague, Principal Consultant at the Neuropower Group and co-founder at Change as Usual. Through her practice and delivery, Pippa aspires to integrate neuroscience and behavioural economics to the world of enterprise change delivery, while having some fun on the way. Pippa's key focus to build stronger and more humanising practices with innovative companies. In this episode, Pippa and I chat about change as usual as a key driving force within organizations and ways to manage and lead it. I am grateful to have Pippa chatting with me today. Pippa, thank you so much for your time and welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast. Very grateful that you've accepted to have this chat with me today.
Oh, my absolute pleasure, Ali. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you very much. Today's topic, Pippa, is about change as usual. Really a topic that is coming up to the surface right now, and everybody or lots of people in the field of change and leadership started to talk more about it. Today, we're going to cover that since you are in the middle of, or you're actually driving that philosophy or way of thinking out in the market. But before we dive deep into it, I would like my listeners to know a little bit about you, Pippa, and your business.
Thank you. So, Pippa Hague, I moved to Australia about 15 years ago. Prior to that, I was working in change roles in the UK, as you might be able to pick up from the accent. And since being in Australia, I've worked as a consultant. I've worked in a large insurer, and then I've come back out into the land of consulting to roll around in a bit of neuroscience of change and do some deeper learning in new subjects that are emerging in the change industry that I find incredibly fascinating.
Excellent. And your business is about change as usual. What's the business value proposition?
What's the crux of it?
Yeah.
So, I think I'll start by just giving a brief kind of explanation of what we mean by change as usual and how it's different in concept from what came before. So we always had this idea of business as usual, right? So the business was in a static state. Somebody came along with a transformation agenda or a big project and said, brilliant, we're going to go from this static state to this other static state, and we need a change plan to be able to help us transition. Part of the challenge that we've got, though, as organizations have an increasing aspiration for agility and for pace and for velocity, is that we've got many, many concurrent projects happening at the same time in the same business, and quite frequently impacting the same parts of the business at the same time. And so what we're finding is that these middle managers are kind of experiencing this sense of compression as they're trying to translate all these different projects into the businesses that they're accountable for supporting and leading. And so the change agenda is now constant. We don't have a static state. There is always the next change which is coming through as organizations respond to kind of the market and the complexity out there. And so as a business, we started out as a bunch of change practitioners who came from the traditional school of change management, right? So we would run portfolios, we would set up change practices, and as a connected network of change professionals, Change as Usual looks after the senior layers of change leadership. So for myself, I came from the position of executive manager of change across a number of organizations where you're the one that's setting up the architecture for how change is going to be delivered into that business environment. And so the Change as Usual business evolved through a response to this kind of rapidly changing world of projects and change delivery.
I want to touch on the topic of leadership. We're not going to go deep into it, but I just want to ask a quick question. We're talking about the change as usual. Do you think, Pippa, is that the type of leadership that is required to lead the change as usual, is that different from the type of leadership that is required to lead transformational programs that usually go on top of the business as usual? Or is leadership a universal thing?
Well, and it's interesting. I think leadership as a construct is shifting as a consequence of the world as it's currently operating. Like none of us have come out of the pandemic the same as we went in, right? And, we had this grand experiment of everybody suddenly pivoting from like not being able to work from home to suddenly everybody having to work from home 5 days a week. And we proved beyond any doubt that we're able to operate as fully remote first organizations, right? Organizations carried on delivering. And I think part of the challenge for leaders coming back into the workplace is that now there is a changing relationship between employers and employees around the types of social contracts that employees want with their employers, particularly in relation to flexibility and hybrid.
Yeah.
And so to be a manager of a hybrid team and to be able to be a leader in the context of hybrid is quite a different skill set. You can't just, you're not going to have visibility over every day, every detail, every micro piece of work that your team is undertaking. And you need to get really good at being clear around the redesign of work within the hybrid context, and then layer into that the embedment of change and culture, and how do you maintain the integrity of teams, and how do you induct and onboard people into culture, and all of those good things. So I think that leadership is still leadership, and being a good change leader is still the same fundamental skills, which is kind of, a great communicator, able to still make decisions in the face of ambiguity and uncertainty, provide stability as you can for your people. All of these facets are still going to be important, but the volume and complexity of change that we're asking people to deal with and the delivery environment of hybrid means that the application of those skills is quite different now than it was even just 5 years ago. So I think leadership's changed,
Fantastic. Yes, and I agree completely. The reason why I asked this question, because I was thinking a lot about when I talk to my clients and in my change practice, when I deal with the leaders and the executives and sponsors of the extra change, the commissioned and the mandated changes that happen on top of their business as usual, I do feel a difference. I feel a level of urgency when it comes to executives that look after the transformational programs, but I don't feel quite that same urgency when I talk to the executives who deal with the business as usual. I interviewed one of my guests. His name is Antonio Neves Rodriguez. He's actually a project manager champion with Harvard Business Review, and he's got his own podcast, but I had the pleasure of interviewing him last year. He has written a book, and I think he does call it now, We Are in the Project Economy. So everything is about projects and change. Does that mean that, from where you sit, that the change as usual is going to be the norm, so it's not going to go away, and therefore there will be more focus on that going forward, because organizations don't always have the limitless budgets to have the extra resources that usually come from our side to help.
Yeah, okay. Well, and there's an assumption underlying that, Ali, which I'm just going to challenge a tiny bit, right? Which is that that projects are only activated through discretionary spend in organizations and require a project team to deliver them. So if you go deep into the heady world of agile and that kind of resource allocation type structure, you're still chunking work down. You're still trying to create a shift from one activity to a different lens of that activity. And so whether that's done at scale in a large project with a change manager and a project manager and a comms person and BAs and tech build and all the rest of it, or whether that's small discretionary team-based change, which is activated by the manager for the purposes of continuous improvement. These things are both still types of projects. They just have different scale and complexity in terms of the governance and funding and resources required to be able to drive the change.
Yeah, okay. To manage their change as usual, organizations would need good capability internally to manage that. What's your take on that, and how do you build that?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of pieces to this. So initially, I think the important part of understanding leadership and managing change as usual is that what we're talking about is concurrent, complex, nonlinear change. And so let me just unpack that. So by complex, I don't mean complicated as in there's lots of process pieces moving. We're talking about organizations that have multifaceted change streams happening. And as a manager in like a claim center or in an operational environment, you may have 5 or 6 different initiatives impacting your area of the business in the same quarter or in the same sprint or in the same month, depending on the delivery mechanism that you've got. And so part of the challenge for managing that is being able to understand and navigate through the complexity of all those different things happening at the same time and holding the space of the translation layer for your people around what actually needs to shift. If you've got a project which is looking at culture shifts, you've got a project which is looking at a technology change, you've got a project which is looking at, give me another example. As the manager, how do you translate that for your people? How do you help your people make sense of that? As a leader of leaders or a leader of people, part of your accountability is to understand the process design and the workflow that happens in your space and manage work as it comes in, make sure it gets allocated to the right people and gets distributed out. And so being able to hold that space for your people is important, and being the point of stability for them in amongst all of that says there's lots of things going on, there's lots of change coming through, rather than kind of feeling as though you're fatigued and exhausted by all the change. Let's just build our change agility muscles so that we lean into the tension of constant change and actually find ourselves excited about kind of, okay, what's coming next and how do we navigate that? And I think that's part of the mental shift that managers of change as usual type team environments need to shift to.
The argument that I usually come across is that change as usual is difficult because most people have got their own day-to-day job. And so sometimes we do expect them to do extra as a result of asking them to manage the change or adopt it. Now, there are a lot of benefits for a team to manage the change, apart from building their own capabilities. As you would know, and we do promote that a lot, which is I think the Gartner group calls that open source change, which is run and managed internally by the people. And so the likelihood of adoption will be far greater if it's actually managed internally. So the challenge is that we do expect people to run their day-to-day jobs, and we do expect them to also add, and manage the extra layers of the new things that we would like them to manage. Mm-hmm. Is the message that if we want the change as usual to be built as a capability, we're going to have to review the day-to-day job of our people?
I'm gonna say yes, because I have a heavy bias towards that.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think that it comes down to there's a fundamental challenge in the Australian design of work system, which is that we're really, really good at organising work linearly, or as process map type style. What we're not great at within organisations in Australia is vertical separation of work.
Yep.
So the work that the frontline does, the work that the leader of team does, the work that the leader of leader does, the work that the leader of function does, the work at those different layers is different. And the work of the manager of others, or the manager of managers, or the leader of leaders, is to design the system to be able to deal with the change and complexity that comes through. Their job is to work on the system, not in the system. And I think part of the tension for change as usual is that it's very easy to get kind of sucked into the linear changes that are happening. The role of the manager is to deal with whatever it is that the organization needs to be able to shift in the system to reach the level of productivity that it needs to service customers, stakeholders, etc. So, I think the role of leadership shifts, and I think the role of management as a practice also needs to shift.
And you're talking here about middle management, Pippa, is that right?
Yeah. Love us all. Those of us who sit in that squishy layer in the middle and try desperately to translate the vision and magnificence of the senior leaders into something which is tangible, practical, and doable for the organization to be able to execute against.
And I see them as the most critical group, actually, for the change as usual.
Yeah, 100%. So a lot of the work that we do as a consultancy is actually developing leadership programs for that middle management layer, because we have this firm belief that it is that layer of the organization that is this translation energy and helps create the agility muscle for change as usual. And the skills that those leaders need are different now than they were in kind of the older school leadership development programs. Before, it wasn't, it was great to be able to be a leader, and leadership development programs were very much on who am I as a leader, and it was LSI or leadership circle or any of those other facets of kind of understanding how people experience you as a leader. What's shifted for me now, I think, is that one of the greatest expectations that we have of leaders is that they are leaders of teams, and that they understand how to manage a team, whether it's hybrid or face-to-face or fully virtual, that they understand how to bring those people together, how to connect them with the vision and intention of the organization, and how to help them be able to deal with the complexity of a constant changing environment.
Yeah. Look, there was a network that I joined recently, and then we did have a discussion around middle management. And I was in a role of middle management in previous jobs myself, in previous lives. And my ambition was always that middle management sees changes as opportunities rather than disruptions to their daily routines and daily operations.
Yeah, 100%. It's a mindset shift for many managers, particularly those that have been in the same kind of roles for extended tenure.
That's exactly right.
It's a very new mindset.
If change is being managed as part of an organization rather than a discretionary mandated change, and people feel that they've owned it and then therefore they've driven it. In fact, I've worked with a big retailer in Australia, and we wanted to do it top down. It failed miserably, and therefore project lost a lot of millions of dollars. And then one day somebody said, well, we asked them point blank what happened, and they said, because it's not my baby. And that not my baby, we went back and we rethought the whole process. And then we've gone from 25 people in the project team to, Pippa, 4, only 4.
Yeah. It's got to be the right 4, right?
It was the right 4, yes.
Right energy.
But it was only 4 people from outside the operation, and then it was all owned by the management team. All we did, we created guide rails for them. We created framework, and we helped them how to measure the progress and the success and the results. And off there you go. And so we created this ripple effect of ownership across the organization.
Yeah. And I think there will always be a place in larger organizations for large scale project teams who pick up and run with a particular project area, like large technology transformations.
Absolutely, yeah.
You're never going to federate out into the business, right? You need the governance, you need the oversight, you need, the solution architects in there kind of making sure all the plugs are going into the right places. But for things which are lower risk, incremental change, giving delegated authority to act out into the business, as you say, creates a beautiful sense of ownership and accountability, which is exactly as it should be. And I think part of the trick for portfolio management teams or program management offices is being able to create an appropriate filtration system that says, okay, let's look at the intention of the organization and the vision and the pillars and everything that we're trying to kind of put into place. And then let's work out which pieces need to be tightly managed versus which things can we put in a construct of tight, loose, tight. And by tight, loose, tight, it's like tight description of what it is we're trying to achieve, tight measurement at the end of did we get there, but in the middle, be loose. Let people take accountability for the work to be done and get out of their way. And your role as a project team is to remove blockers and to create the right conversations and to connect people across the business that are upstream and downstream from each other in terms of where the change is going to be impacting. So it's a different, the role's shifting for us as well.
Yeah, look, I want to unpack that. Get out of the way in the middle, flexibility, which is not really easy. It's a complex process. It's very hard for managers to let go of control. What are some of the things that we need to let go of? For example, we know the starting point, we know the finish line, we know what the success looks like. What are some of the levers or things that we need to do to enable people to swim between the flags? And have that flexibility with a level of trust, a level of autonomy, but also being there available to support if support is needed.
Yeah, and I think you've nailed it there pretty much. I think part of the challenge for this kind of work is being really clear about what trust looks and feels like. There is also, I think, something incredibly important about being really clear around decision making,
yes.
And how decisions get made, and also super importantly, how decisions that do get made are communicated, and then also how prioritization works. And so I think from a project governance and oversight perspective, there's something around making a commitment to transparency to whatever degree it is that's appropriate for the change that you're putting through.
Yeah.
There's something really important about asynchronous support. So whether that's documentation, decision logs, communication guides, key message documents, if there are certain core themes or communications that need to be kind of communicated out to people as a consistent message, then part of the power of kind of using short videos as way of connecting people to, we've just come out of the steering committee, these are the 5 things that we spoke about, these were the 3 decisions that were shifted, these 2 priorities still say the same, this one thing has shifted a bit, 2-minute video, everybody gets consistent story. So I think there's something in there around the project team being really clear about what are going to be the communication and engagement anchors throughout the project that the managers, wherever they are working in their spokes away from the hub, get to kind of rely on as their way of knowing what's going on so that they can do what they need to do. People have different rhythms and rituals for the way that they engage their teams. Yep. People have different cadence for the volume and complexity of change that they're navigating and dealing with. And as a project team, you're never going to truly understand the weight of that, right? So our job is to work with those managers and say, okay, what support do you need from us? This is where you've got to get to. This is the timeline that we're looking at. Here's all the communications, learning and training support. What else can we do to help you?
Fantastic. I want to then segue to, if change as usual is going to be an ongoing thing and expectation from organizations, and does that mean, through your experience, Pippa, does that mean that we need to look at the success measures for a manager or a middle manager going forward? And then those performance measures, do we need to look at those and include items like change as usual or how we manage change or the success of change? Because when we ask an existing team to manage the change themselves on top of what they do, and we give them all the support. However, I think, do I have the ability to say, hey, Ali, you are responsible, or is that a good to have and a nice to have if the project succeeds? I'm going to maybe articulate this differently. First of all, do we review the the success measures for a middle manager?
I think that so the measure of success has to sit where the proof of outcome sits, right? Okay, so there's no point. And I think part of it's a tricky one, right? And I can see where you're heading with the question. I have a perspective, but it's not one that I'm strongly wedded to at this point. I think that change, as usual, each individual facet of the change that's happening in a system doesn't exist and cannot exist in isolation.
Sure.
So if you're trying to shift the culture of an organization and you're wanting to go through a big growth period and blah, 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 whatever it is that the change is, as an organization at a meta level, you need to have a clear story about where you think the organization will be in 6 months or a year. And then rather than projects having micro level success measures, the whole organization needs to be lined up to the meta success measures. So, for example, we will move our organization from having an ENPS of minus 50 to an ENPS of positive 50.
Yeah.
Okay, that's an organizational measure that everybody in the organization can align to and work towards. We want to see an increase in, whatever the profitability metric in whichever industry is from X% to X%. If that information is getting reported back out into the business, everybody can see, is the decision that I'm making moving us towards that as a business or away from that as a business? And do I feel as though I'm supported in making that decision?
Yeah.
And so I think the trying to do micro success measures in a complex system is it takes a lot of energy for limited value.
Yeah.
But if you're measuring middle managers rather on the experience of their teams, the productivity of their teams, and the quality of their customer experiences, or whatever their particular sector measurements might be, then that's a more powerful and useful metric for the manager.
Always. The measurement of lag indicators are always probably far more important. Implementing a CRM is not really the goal. The goal is what are you going to use the information for and how are you going to use the tool. So that's I think that's where you're aiming at. For a team member within a team, Pippa, sometimes I always say, like, for example, change champions, they are your first layer of change as usual.
Absolutely.
But most of the time, I always say, whatever they're doing is really great, but I can't pin them down. The outcome is a responsibility for this particular team. Whatever they're doing is actually on top of what they're supposed to be doing, and it's not quite part of their role. And this is where the leader engagement with the teams but it's always going to be their challenge of, if I am becoming part of this change and I will help and support and I will go out of my way, at the end of the day, it's still a discretionary effort and not a responsibility.
I think you're containing the answer to the problem in the way that you're framing the statement there, though, Ali, which is that if we are... There's two types of change champion. There's an active change champion who, as part of their day-to-day work, is given a part-time accountability to support any given change for a project. Mm-hmm. And I think that's still a very valid position. And you're right? We can't rely on discretionary effort of change champions if we're going to hold them then accountable for the outcome and the success of the change.
Yes.
Like, if you're asking somebody to take accountability for successfully deploying change, then you need to give them the delegated authority to act, and you need to give them the support and the credibility to be able to drive the change.
Yes.
So I think that's super important to be able to get that stuff right. The more kind of social network analysis driven change champion, which is kind of like, who are the influencers and movers and shapers in the system, and how do we get them to help us kind of, move change along? I think there's a really careful ethical line that you have to follow with kind of finding the influences in organizations and catalysting them as change champions. And I think part of that is you don't want to be getting them to use their influence in the organization Machiavellianly. I've always been of the view that you find where those influences are, and then your job is just to give them the best possible information available about what's going on and let them get on with it, get out of their way and let them do what they do normally, right? If they're the person that organizes coffees for everybody and loves to have a good gossip about what's going on, give them the information and let them do what they do in the system so that the system kind of organically has the best information available out there.
Yeah. And look, some organizations have got the capacity to take people offline and dedicate them to the projects. These influencers, I did work with an insurance company before, and then I was able to put my case forward that there are certain influencers that I would like to take offline for a couple of months. There's a cost involved. However, I've given them the responsibility, and I expected them to deliver A, B, and C, and so that's become their mandated responsibility. And only then that I'll be able to hold them accountable and responsible for the outcomes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's another layer of change champions, the discretionary effort, which is not a bad thing.
Yeah, look, and I think discretionary effort, the hint's in the title. It's at the discretion of the employee as to whether or not they decide to put that energy into the system.
Yep.
And so if you're driving a multi-million-dollar change program into a large, complex organization, don't rely on people's goodwill.
No, that's not a good decision.
No.
I want to shift gear, and I want to ask you, based on your experience, Pippa, change as usual, do you see any difference in the way industries or certain industries manage their change as usual? Are there industries actually better positioned to manage change as usual? Is it the tech companies? And what about between private sector and public sector? Is there a difference?
Ooh, taking me into dangerous territory there, Ali.
I can tell you right now.
Well, and I think that
let's talk about the first one.
Has the challenges. So in relation to industries, whether it's tech or not. So I think that it depends on the organization's inherent agility and the need that they have to be responsive to the market. And I think it's always going to be that the work to be done drives the level of agility and drives the level of change agility and change muscle that an organization needs to have. If you are in a sector that has to respond at pace to emerging trends, then you need to be able to pivot and respond really fast. If you are turning a very, very large cruise ship with a little tiny tugboat, you can't expect aerial gymnastics. Like it's going to be slow moving, and it's going to be a cautious journey to make any large scale change. And I think that really is the determining characteristic of the level of change agility that organizations need.
The reason why I'm asking this
question, respond to the work to be done, right?
The reason why I'm asking about this is certainly the banking industry went through a lot of changes after the
to the Royal Commission. Yeah, we all remember it well.
Yeah, so you would make a informed assumption that the amount of change that went through those organizations, people are slightly more resilient, and therefore they are more adaptive to lots of changes. That's the pace of the change. Well, look at what's happening now in America and around banking industry. All of a sudden, we started looking at the banking industry again. And I'm not picking on this particular industry, but they've gone through a lot of change, and they're continuously being shaped. And therefore, so you'll assume that employees in those organizations, they see change all the time. And so their machine is not really does not take a lot of time to pivot and change. And therefore, when leaders talk about change, it's part of the lingo and the expectations rather than, oh my God, where did this come from?
Well, and you tapped on to, just triggered me for a slightly tangential response, but I'm going to go there.
Sure.
So part of the reason that change is hard is because our brains are fundamentally wired to change only a little bit at a time. And from a neurochemical perspective, we are set up in such a way that when things stay the same, we get dopamine and we just trickle along and everything feels great.
Yeah.
The moment that something shifts, the moment that the pattern of the way that we make decisions and the things that we do changes, the dopamine gets taken away and we get a little adrenaline spike and everything becomes like hyper-focused because we're like, what is the new danger? What is the thing that's changing in my very stable, happy little world?
Yes.
When you are in an environment where change is constant and you've got constant shifting, you become it normalizes very quickly. You level up to be able to say, okay, now in this part of my life, in this cycle of where I am, we organizational structures every 6 months. We change products every 2 years. Whatever the rhythm and the cadence within the organization is, becomes normalized very quickly.
Yeah.
And so it's not that people become more resilient to change. They just get used to dealing with more of it. And so the questions that they ask about what's shifting in their world become simpler questions. They don't, they're not so worried about, is my role going to be impacted? Because their experience over the last 7 years is that every time there's been an organizational restructure, they've got to roll out of it, and the role's been interesting. And so therefore the fear of something new and uncertain and unanticipated is no longer there for them. They've got a little bit more ability to go, okay, well, this is just another org change, so I don't need to worry about that too much. I know I'll get a job out of it, so I can be more curious about why we're changing and what's going to be different and what type of role I might like to have in it. And so all of our response to change is driven by fear of loss and loss aversion, and how do we make sure that we can keep things as stable as possible.
Yeah, and the word curiosity is the key, isn't it? We are coming to the end of the podcast, and I'm thoroughly enjoying this. But before we finish, I'm thoroughly enjoying this. Change as usual. I hope you're going to write a book about this, Pippa, at some stage in your life.
Who's got time? I'm too busy.
And well done for you and for your organization. I really like the way you articulated your thoughts around the change as usual. What would be your advice to the change practice community?
So I think so much. I think the core of it comes back to what we were just saying there, Ali. Like this sense of eternal curiosity and not being afraid of the uncertainty and ambiguity of what's coming over the hill, I think is the thing which has drawn all of us as change practitioners to the work in the first place.
Yes.
Like most change practitioners that I know started being change practitioners because they just don't like change. And they want to control it, and they want to manage it. And myself, I was very much from the ethos of I've had experienced badly managed change, whether that's familial or work.
Yeah.
And all I want is to be able to create an environment where change isn't threatening and frightening and anxiety raising, but change can be curious. It can drive curiosity and playfulness and interest and learning. And so I think the power for change practitioners comes from fostering that sense of playful curiosity and inquiry in all things that are changing in the system. And helping people move away from fear and anxiety, because change is a constant. We are not going to suddenly stabilize and everything become slow moving and gentle. The pace and velocity of the world that we're operating in, particularly with exponential technologies coming through, ChatGPT, wow, the next 5 to 10 years even is just going to be so intense as we work out how all these new amazing technologies can shift the work that we do, the way that we work and the way that we engage with employment. And so, as change practitioners, be curious, come with a set of powerful questions around how do we help people engage and see the joy in work again, and to have that playful energy and to have that playful curiosity.
Fantastic. Playful energy. And also one thing that I always find fascinating, Pippa, is that through helping people, I learn something about myself. In every single project, I uncover something that I haven't really thought about myself as a human, as a mindset, and as a capability as well. So wise words. Thank you very much. How would employers and people reach you, Pippa?
Probably the easiest way is to tap into my LinkedIn account and connect to me through there. So that's Pippa Hague, Pippahague.
Excellent. We're going to put all the information about you and the podcast information. Really loved our conversation today. I hope I'm going to get you back at some stage in the future and talk about maybe the change that is not business as usual, and pick your brain on it. But thoroughly enjoy the conversation. I'm eternally grateful for your time, Pippa. Until next time, stay strong and be well.
Thank you. And thank you for everything that you're doing to help the change community stay connected. I think it's great work, Ali. So good luck with the rest of the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. To know more about my guests and this podcast, check the innergameofchange.com.au website. And remember, subscribe. I can't wait to share with you my next podcast. Until then, stay well and stay safe.